So, you know, geography. And this is a landmass called Pangaea, meaning a supercontinent. Oh, and here's Australia. Eventually, this Pangaea transforms to something like this. And then, people from these areas are like, hey, let's move south. So they do, across this landmass here. And whoops, geography happened, and now Australia is an island. Pretty big one. The second largest island behind Greenland. Anyway, around 40,000 BC, during an ice age, when Asia was still connected to Australia via land bridges, the Aborigine migration happened. Soon when the ice age ended, around 8,000 BC, that's quite soon, that's when sea levels rose, cutting off Tasmania. Now around 1642, a fella called Abel Tasman, cough cough, Tasman, sound familiar? No? Anyway, Abel reached and sighted the west coast of Tasmania and called his discovery Van Diemen's Land, after the Governor General of the Dutch East Indies. This man discovered a lot of things actually, including New Zealand, named after the Dutch province of New Zealand, Tonga and the Fiji Islands, and most importantly, New Holland, current day Australia. Soon after, in years to come, for example by the time 1770 came around, more than 50 European ships made landfall on Australian soil, which at the time was only inhabited by the indigenous people. During this time, James Cook claimed the eastern coast of Australia as New South Wales, a new colony for Great Britain. Soon after, other countries began bugging off since the land didn't seem fertile enough. It's important to note, some people believe the Portuguese to be the first to discover Australia. Now, life was hard for the ordinary people in the 17th century, and punishments for these minor crimes were severe. In England, you could be hanged for over 200 different offences. However, as an alternative to hanging prisoners, some were transported to colonial territories like America. But then the US War of Independence happened from 1775 to 1783, so you couldn't really afford to send prisoners over, but instead had to send soldiers. So a new destination had to be found, and it was found. And thus, the prisoners were transported to Botany Bay, Australia. Reasons for claiming Australia were that the Brits were hoping to build naval bases there as a landing pad for the Pacific, as well as hoping to find sources of timber and flax. The first fleet of convicts had 11 ships, with 760 convicts in total. Most of them men, with sailors and marines. This voyage was led by Captain Arthur Phillip. Soon after this first fleet, a second one arrived in 1790 and a third in 1791. At first these convicts worked on government land for provisions, but after 3 years, those who behaved well were freed and given grants of land. Also the first free settlers arrived later this year as well, in 1793. Not too many people came to Australia during the Anglo-French War, since obviously war makes sea transportation difficult. Despite this, the colonies grew, even a new settlement being founded on Tasmania Island. By 1825, the European populace was 25,000. Not all went smoothly in the early 1800s. Numerous rebellions led by Irishmen, convicts and soldiers alike. Meanwhile, Brisbane was founded in 1825 and WA colonised in 1829. With the foundation of Perth, soon after a bunch of new settlements were founded, like Melbourne and Adelaide. In 1815, thousands of new settlers arrived, fleeing poverty in England. The European populace in Australia went from 160,000 in 1840 to 430,000 in 1851. With a new influx of people, a new separate state called Victoria was created, as well as Queensland. Then in 1851, the gold rush happened, and the population rose from 430,000 in 1851 to 10 years later it began becoming over 1.2 million, having 250,000 of those people in the cities of Melbourne and Sydney. Now in the late 19th century, Northern Australia began to grow when Darwin was founded in 1869. Cattle at the time were very important to the northern economy, but because of the hot climate, there were also sugar plantations. In 1850, the first universities had been constructed. Railway boom had propelled the economy in 1875, along with improved of communications during the 1880s, but a 10-year drought affected immigration numbers heavily. One gold rush later, and an increase of population in Western Australia, Australia itself became an independent nation on the 1st of January 1901, when the British Parliament passed legislation allowing the 6 Australian colonies to govern in their own right, as a part of the Commonwealth of Australia, set up as a constitutional monarchy. A new capital of Canberra was created since they couldn't decide if the capital would be in Melbourne or Sydney, so they just did it down the middle. At this time, Australia had a population of 3.4 million. In World War I, after the declaration of war in 1914, the first Australian forces left by ship in November and were sent to Egypt. British plans to seize the Dardanelles from the Turkish that would allow access to the Black Sea was crucial. If the Dardanelles were secure, they could march to Constantinople, capitulate the Ottomans, and protect Russia from naval bombardment, but the first Gallipoli Peninsula had to be secured. In April 1915, the Anzacs, the Australian-New Zealand Army Corps, were sent to Gallipoli. Despite this, a long and terrible stalemate continued, having over 8,000 Anzac casualties. These veterans were then sent to the Western Front, along with new recruits, where a rough 60,000 Australian men died. After the war, Australia annexed German Papua New Guinea, and same after, Australia had a lot of early immigration, but after workers creating industrial unrest, the economy went into depression in late 1920s. By the end of 1932, unemployment was at 30%. Luckily that year things got better as well, as it fell back down to 10%. 1932 is also an important year for the Great Emu War, where the Australian Army technically lost a battle to the nuisance wildlife that were the emus. I mean, there was literally a war on the emus. Now, because the Australians just started to be more common to modern warfare, and so soldiers armed with Lewis guns started to kill emus. Now, despite this and several attempts later, the war was lost. And later in 1934, 42 and 48, the regions, again home to farmers, were infiltrated by emus. Although this time the government didn't give military aid, a solution was found by putting bounties on emus, with over 57,000 bounties being claimed in a 6-month time period. That seemed to solve the issue. During the Second World War, Australia once again joined. Anzacs were sent to North Africa, where they played a vital role. However, when Japan entered on December 1942, the homeland was once again in danger. When Singapore fell in February 1942, and 1,600 Aussies being captured, along with air raids on Darwin, with Japanese submarines entering harbours, it was time to go on the offensive. The Australians fought under the Americans, with the Dutch in the New Guinea and East Indies against the Japanese in the Indonesian campaigns. After 1942, the economy boomed. After the war, displaced people left homeless after the war were welcomed into Australia, but not Asians. The Asians who fled to Australia during the war were deported. Arthur Calwell, Minister of Immigration, said, "Two Wongs do not make a white." Luckily enough, in the late 60s, policies changed, allowing an influx of Asian migrants to come in their 70s and 80s, along with other European migrants. During this time, treatment of the indigenous also improved. As of now, Australia is home to over 23 million people and has a steady economy, and the Sydney Opera House was opened in 1732. Thanks for watching, and as always, like and subscribe. This one was done with a little bit more research than the other one, so don't complain. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and of course, criticism is appreciated, not complaints or whatever. I do have a Patreon, so if you want to go ahead and check that as well, you're free. Goodbye.